That morning, my husband left early for another work trip. 3 days, maybe 4. And I didn't ask for details because lately there didn't seem to be much point in pretending we were still curious about each other's lives. Later, while heading out to get coffee, the elevator stopped on P2 and Logan stepped in. He lives down the hall, always gives off this energy like he's just come back from something. Maybe a run, maybe a meeting, but somehow avoids looking rushed or tired. He nodded toward the corner of the elevator, casually mentioning a broken window he'd seen on B1 near the storage units. I hadn't noticed anything, but I said something neutral like, "That sucks," just to fill the space between us. We ended up talking more than I expected, about the building, about how no one ever really reports anything around here, how management seems more focused on repainting hallways than fixing security issues. But it wasn't small talk in the usual sense. His voice had a quiet confidence, like he didn't need to say much to be heard, and he didn't look at his phone once. Somewhere between the lobby and the ground floor, he said, "You seem like you're always somewhere else." Not in a judgmental way, more like he actually noticed. I shrugged and replied, "Probably because it's easier than feeling stuck in the same place." He didn't laugh or push back. He just gave the smallest nod, then walked out when the doors opened, as if he'd said exactly what he meant and didn't need to explain it. I stood there a few seconds longer than I meant to, and I couldn't figure out why that conversation stayed with me. Maybe it was just because, for the first time in a long while, someone spoke to me like I was still paying attention to the world. A couple of days later, I saw Logan again, this time near the self-service car wash just outside the complex. It was one of those accidental run-ins where you pretend to be surprised, but something about the way we both slowed down made me think neither of us really minded. He was wiping down his windshield, sleeves pushed up, sun hitting the side of his face in that early evening way that makes everything look more intentional than it is. I pulled up 2 stalls down, rolled down my window and said something stupid about the weather, which he ignored in favor of a real question. He asked if I always looked so ready to leave. I laughed, more out of reflex than amusement, and told him I wasn't exactly the type to hand out emotions to people who didn't earn them. He tilted his head a little, like he wasn't sure if I was being defensive or just honest. We ended up sitting on the curb, waiting for our cars to dry, sharing a silence that wasn't heavy, just unfamiliar. I found myself watching how he moved, how he rubbed his palms together while thinking, how he looked off into space between sentences, like he was measuring what to say next. There was something quiet building in my chest, tension, but not the kind tied to fear or nerves. It was more like standing too close to a door you're not sure you want to open. I didn't know what I was hoping he'd say, or if I even wanted him to say anything at all. But I stayed there anyway, as the sun dropped lower, letting the silence stretch out longer than I usually could stand. That night, I walked past the study on my way to the kitchen and heard my husband's voice through the barely cracked door. He was on the phone with someone, speaking low but not low enough. I paused, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because the words hit with that cold kind of precision that makes you instantly alert. He said, "You need to be more careful. She's starting to get suspicious." And then there was a pause. Maybe someone replying on the other end, but I didn't wait to hear more. I moved past the doorway and opened the fridge like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just caught the first real thread of something unraveling. That night at dinner, I didn't bring it up, not because I was afraid of his answer, but because part of me already knew I wasn't going to get one. He asked about my day, made some offhand comment about traffic, and I nodded along, all while filing away every detail into that private place in my head where quiet realizations go to mature. The next morning, I got a message from Logan that just said, "If you ever need anything looked into, let me know. I do private audit work." There was no pressure, no explanation, just a line that carried more weight than I was ready to deal with. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to, then typed back, "Not yet. Just talk to me." he replied almost immediately, offering to meet. For coffee? And I said yes, without thinking too much. Because at that moment, more than answers or accusations, I just needed someone to speak to who wasn't acting like everything was still normal. We met at a small corner cafe with a wraparound veranda, the kind of place people choose when they want to feel like they've stepped outside their own lives for a little while. And as soon as I saw Logan already sitting at a table, legs stretched out, hands wrapped around a plain white mug, I realized I hadn't done something this simple without an agenda in years. We didn't talk about the message or my husband or anything that might crack the moment in half. Instead, the conversation drifted between things that didn't require conclusions. Travel stories, the weird silence of this part of town at night, the way people stop noticing each other when they've lived too close for too long. At one point, he said something about how hard it is to feel like a person when all anyone wants is for you to function, and I felt the words hit somewhere I'd forgotten still reacted. I didn't respond right away, just watched the way he traced the rim of his cup with his finger, like he wasn't waiting for validation, only letting a thought exist without needing to explain it. By the time we got up to leave, the light was softer, the air cooler, and the pause between goodbye and walking away lasted just a breath too long. He stepped a little closer, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough that I didn't move back. When he leaned in, our lips touched for less than a second. A kiss so light it could have been imagined, but I felt it long after we parted, like an echo that settled somewhere I couldn't quite name. The next morning, while looking for an old warranty in the hallway cabinet, I pulled out a dusty photo album I hadn't touched in years, and out of habit more than curiosity, I flipped through the pages until a loose photo slid out and landed face up on the floor, showing my husband with a woman I didn't recognize. She had one arm around his waist and a smile that didn't seem casual. I stared at the image longer than I should have, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because it was the first time I had concrete proof that something had been going on long before I let myself even suspect. I sent a picture of it to Logan without a caption, and within minutes he called, his voice lower than usual, telling me he'd seen the woman before. Said she was linked to a consulting firm he'd come across a few times in cases involving offshore accounts and undeclared assets. The connection was too thin to mean anything on its own, but just hearing it out loud made everything I'd been brushing aside feel harder to ignore. Still, I didn't tell Logan to dig deeper, didn't ask for more names or dates, because, part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know how deep this went, or what it would cost to know for sure. Instead, I told my husband I was meeting friends for dinner, made up a story about trying out a new Pilates studio, and got into my car with a strange feeling in my chest. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, just the quiet sense that I had started lying back. Every time I saw Logan after that, something in our conversations began to shift, like we both understood we were standing on ground that wouldn't stay stable for long, but neither of us wanted to step away first. The days started folding into each other in that blurred way that happens when you're keeping too many stories straight, and though Logan and I continued running into each other, mailboxes, lobby, once outside the dry cleaner, it never felt like coincidence anymore, more like an orbit we'd stopped trying to break. One afternoon, we sat on a bench near the back of the building where no one really goes, and he asked about the things that scared me. Not in a dramatic way, just quiet and steady, like he wasn't rushing me to answer. I told him I used to believe in the idea of a clean life, marriage, routine, mutual respect, but that now I wasn't sure if I'd confused stability with silence. Logan didn't argue. He just said he didn't trust anything that looked perfect from the outside, because it usually meant someone inside was being quiet out of survival, not peace. Later that same week, my neighbor Karen mentioned my husband used to go to Austin often, always alone, always vague about the trips, and her voice had that offhand tone people use when they're giving you information disguised as gossip. It was The first time I realized how many people around me might have been watching longer than I had. Found the note folded in half at the bottom of my bag, wedged between a receipt and a half-used pack of gum, and when I opened it, the handwriting was rushed, almost aggressive, just 5 words: "Watch your back." Not everyone plays fair. There was no name, no signature, nothing to trace. But my hands stayed still for a long moment as I stared at the paper like it might offer more if I looked hard enough. I showed it to Logan later that evening, and he read it twice before saying he didn't think it came from my husband, more likely someone nearby, someone who'd seen us, someone trying to pull us apart before we crossed a line we couldn't walk back from. That night, my husband came home 2 hours later than usual. No explanation, no apology, just a distracted nod and a passing comment about work dragging on, and I didn't press him. I didn't ask who he'd been with or why his shirt smelled faintly like a bar. It wasn't fear holding me back anymore. It was something heavier. The quiet fatigue of knowing the truth wouldn't offer relief, only more weight I wasn't sure I wanted to carry. I decided to host a small dinner for the neighbors, a harmless gesture to reset the atmosphere. Though deep down, I think I just wanted to see how everyone looked when sitting at the same table, breathing the same air, pretending they didn't notice what was shifting beneath the surface. Logan showed up with a bottle of wine, claiming Karen, invited him last minute. And when I saw the way my husband looked at him, too casual to be natural, I realized they both knew more about each other than either had ever said out loud. The evening crawled by with forced laughs and polite chewing, and even though no one spoke directly, the tension moved between plates and glances like it had its own place at the table. After the guests left and I started cleaning up, my husband leaned against the counter and said, "You've changed. It's like living with a stranger who's learned how to mimic you just enough." I didn't argue, because he wasn't wrong. And the worst part was that I didn't even feel the urge to deny it. Logan stopped answering my messages without warning. No explanation, no slow fade. Just silence so complete it felt intentional, like someone had cut a thread I hadn't realized. Was holding part of me upright. I told myself not to overthink it, that maybe he'd left town, maybe it wasn't about me. But the absence settled in quickly, colder than I expected. Days later, I opened one of my husband's desk drawers looking for a charger and found a slim folder buried beneath some tax papers. Inside were printed screenshots, time-stamped messages, surveillance-style notes, even a few grainy photos. Every conversation I'd had with Logan, every meeting, every lie I'd told to cover them. He had known for weeks, maybe longer, and instead of confronting me, he had quietly gathered the pieces, as if waiting for something. He left the next morning without saying where he was going, stayed away for 3 days, and when he returned, he didn't raise his voice or ask questions. He just looked through me like someone revisiting a memory they no longer felt connected to. He packed his things quietly, moving through the apartment like someone who had already left days ago. And when the door finally closed behind him, there was no slam. No last look, just the sound of a life exiting without ceremony. Later that evening, I sat on the same balcony where I'd first noticed Logan walking his dog. Back when all of this was just passing glances and shared elevators, and stared down at the parking lot that had somehow become the stage for everything I hadn't meant to start. My phone buzzed once. His name, one message. You never wanted to leave. You just wanted someone to make it easier to stay angry. I read it twice, and though it stung, I couldn't argue with it. Now the apartment is still, and the silence feels less like peace and more like the absence of motion. The pause after a scene ends but before the lights come back on. I keep thinking about that kiss on the veranda, the weightless kind that shouldn't matter, but somehow did, because it tilted something inside me that I've been trying to untangle ever since.